The scorching sun beat down on Clara Calloway's face as she stumbled through the parched New Mexico terrain, the last drops of water from her canteen having disappeared hours ago. It was the summer of 1878, and the journey to truth or consequences had proven far more treacherous than she had anticipated when she'd left Santa Fe 3 days prior. Clara's vision blurred as she tripped over a rock, her knees hitting the hard, cracked earth. The stagecoach had broken an axle 10 miles back, and the driver had insisted they couldn't wait for her when she'd said she needed to rest. "Town's just over that ridge, madam," he'd lied, pointing toward the distant horizon before leaving her with her single trunk and the promise that he'd send help. No help had come. And now, as the merciless afternoon sun climbed higher, Clara felt her strength failing. Her throat was raw, her lips cracked and bleeding, and her blue calico dress clung to her sweat-drenched body. She tried to stand again, but her legs buckled beneath her. "Just a little further," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible in the vast emptiness surrounding her. But her body had other ideas. As she attempted to rise once more, the world tilted violently. The last thing Clara saw before darkness claimed her was a dust cloud rising in the distance. Preston Sawyer had been tracking a stray calf since dawn when he spotted something unusual in the distance, a splash of blue against the red-brown earth. Pulling his bay stallion to a halt, he shaded his eyes against the glare and squinted. "What in tarnation?" he muttered, guiding his horse closer. As the distance closed, his heart leapt to his throat. It wasn't something, it was someone. Preston dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, boots hitting the ground hard as he ran toward the crumpled form of a woman lying motionless on the baked earth. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, spreading around her like a halo. Her face, though flushed with sunburn, held a delicate beauty that caught him off guard. "Madam," he knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his touch, and her skin burned like fire. "Madam, can you hear me?" No response. Heat exhaustion, possibly leading to heatstroke if he didn't act fast. Preston had seen it before cowboys who'd been out too long without water, travelers unprepared for New Mexico's unforgiving summer. Moving quickly, he retrieved his water canteen from his saddle and gently lifted the woman's head. "Come on now, you've got to drink something," he said, carefully dribbling water between her parched lips. Some of it trickled down her chin, but he saw her throat move slightly as she unconsciously swallowed. Preston glanced around, knowing they were at least 8 miles from his ranch and nearly 15 from truth or consequences. She needed shade and more water than he could give her here. Decision made, he gathered her limp form into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite the voluminous dress. Nearby, he spotted a small trunk, her belongings, he presumed. It would have to wait. "Hold on, madam," he murmured as he lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her and cradling her against his chest. "I've got you now." The journey back to the Sawyer ranch seemed interminable with the unconscious woman slumped against him. Preston kept one arm securely around her waist while using his free hand to guide his horse across the familiar terrain. Every few minutes, he'd pause to give her more water, though most of it spilled down her chin and onto her dress. His ranch appeared on the horizon just as the sun began its descent. The modest 2-story house with its wide porch was a welcome sight. As they approached, his ranch hand Elijah came running from the stables. "Mr. Sawyer, what in heaven's name?" "Heat exhaustion," Preston called out, already dismounting and carefully pulling the woman down into his arms. "Found her collapsed about 8 miles east. There's a trunk out there too, can you fetch it tomorrow?" "Yes, sir," Elijah replied, taking the reins of Preston's horse. "Should I fetch the doctor?" Preston hesitated, looking down at the woman's flushed face. "Let me try to cool her down first. If she doesn't improve by nightfall, you'll have to make the trip to town." Inside the house, Preston carried the stranger to the guest bedroom on the first floor. Mrs. Abernathy, his housekeeper, gasped when she saw them. "Good Lord, Mr. Sawyer, who is this poor creature?" "Don't know her name," Preston said, laying the woman gently on the bed. "Found her collapsed in the desert. She needs cool water and cloths right away, Mrs. Abernathy, a widow in her 50s who'd been with the Sawyer family since Preston was a boy, immediately sprang into action. Within minutes, she had brought a basin of cool water and several clean cloths. "We need to get her out of these heavy clothes," the older woman said practically. "They're soaked through with sweat and keeping the heat in. You step outside now, Mr. Sawyer. I'll tend to her." Preston nodded, reluctantly leaving the room. He paced the hallway, rubbing his jaw anxiously. He'd found people stranded in the desert before it wasn't uncommon in this harsh territory, but something about this woman's delicate features had stirred something protective in him. Maybe it was the way she'd been abandoned, or perhaps it was simply that she was the first woman besides Mrs. Abernathy he'd brought to this house since his parents had died 3 years prior. After what seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Abernathy emerged from the room, carrying a bundle of damp clothing. "I've got her in one of my nightgowns," she reported. "Poor thing's burning up with fever, but I've got cool compresses on her forehead and wrists. We need to keep changing them regularly." "Will she be all right?" Preston asked, surprised by the intensity of his concern for a complete stranger. "Hard to say. She's young and seems strong, but the heat can be merciless." Mrs. Abernathy studied his face. "You'll be wanting to sit with her, I expect." Preston nodded, not bothering to question why it mattered so much. "I'll take the first watch. You can relieve me at midnight." Throughout the night, Preston and Mrs. Abernathy took turns bathing the unconscious woman's face and wrists with cool water, occasionally managing to get her to swallow a few drops. By dawn, her breathing had become more regular, though fever still colored her cheeks. It was just past sunrise when Clara's eyelids fluttered open. Confusion clouded her hazel eyes as she stared up at the unfamiliar wooden ceiling. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse croak emerged from her parched throat. Preston, who had dozed off in the chair beside her bed, jerked awake at the sound. "You're awake," he said, leaning forward with evident relief. "Here, drink this." He held a glass of water to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand. Clara drank greedily, coughing a little as the cool liquid soothed her raw throat. When she could finally speak, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You're at the Sawyer Ranch, about 8 miles from truth or consequences," Preston replied, setting the empty glass aside. "I'm Preston Sawyer. Found you collapsed out on the flats yesterday afternoon. You were suffering from heat exhaustion, nearly heat stroke. You're lucky to be alive, miss." "Calloway," she managed. "Clara Calloway. I was on the stagecoach to truth or consequences when it broke an axle. The driver said town was just over the ridge, but—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of her state of undress beneath the unfamiliar nightgown. A blush deeper than her sunburn spread across her cheeks. Noting her discomfort, Preston stood up. "Mrs. Abernathy, my housekeeper, tended to you. Your clothes were soaked through. I'll let her know you're awake. She'll want to check on you." As he turned to leave, Clara weakly caught his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. You saved my life." Something warm and unfamiliar stirred in Preston's chest at the touch of her hand. "Just doing what any decent person would, Miss Calloway. Rest now. You're safe here." Over the next 2 days, Clara gradually regained her strength. Mrs. Abernathy proved to be a nurturing, if somewhat stern, caretaker, bringing nourishing broths and insisting that Clara remain in bed despite her protests that she had imposed long enough. "Nonsense," the housekeeper said firmly on the second afternoon. "You try standing up too soon and you'll end up right back where you started. Besides, Mr. Sawyer won't hear of you leaving until you're fully recovered." Clara smoothed the quilt covering her lap. "He's been very kind, but I can't stay here indefinitely. I have business in truth or consequences." Mrs. Abernathy raised an eyebrow as she straightened the curtains. "Business? If you don't mind my asking, what brings a young woman like yourself to these parts alone?" Clara hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. "I've inherited a property there. My uncle Harold Calloway passed away 3 months ago. I only learned of it recently." "Harold Calloway?" Mrs. Abernathy turned, surprise evident on her face. "Old Harry was your uncle?" "Well, I never. He owned the mercantile in town, largest store for 50 miles. "Yes," Clara nodded. "My father and he had a falling out years ago before I was born. I never knew him. The letter from his lawyer was quite unexpected. The door opened before Mrs. Abernathy could respond, and Preston entered carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. He had shaved since Clara had last seen him, and his dark hair was neatly combed. He looked younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his early 30s, with sun-weathered skin and kind brown eyes. "Afternoon, Miss Calloway. Thought you might like some tea, Mrs. Abernathy's biscuits are famous in these parts." Clara smiled, oddly pleased by his appearance. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Sawyer. Mrs. Abernathy was just telling me she knew my uncle, Harry Calloway." Preston set the tray down on the bedside table. Of course everyone knew Harry. "Good man, fair in business. Town hasn't been the same since he passed. You're his niece, then?" Clara nodded. "I've inherited his store, apparently. I came to see it and decide whether to sell or—" She trailed off, uncertain. The truth was, she had no real plan beyond escaping Philadelphia and the scandal that had destroyed her reputation there. "Well, it's a fine establishment," Preston said, pouring her tea with a steadiness that surprised her in such a big, obviously strong man. "Truth or consequences is growing. Railroads coming through next year, they say." "Mr. Sawyer," Clara said, accepting the cup, "I don't know how to thank you properly for saving my life." He looked embarrassed. "No thanks needed, Miss Calloway. But if you're determined to get to town, I can take you in my wagon once you're stronger. Probably in another day or two, if Mrs. Abernathy agrees you're fit for travel." The housekeeper snorted. "At the very earliest, that sun took more out of you than you realize, young lady." Clara knew they were right. She still felt weak as a newborn kitten, but the thought of imposing further on Preston's hospitality made her uncomfortable. Not to mention the impropriety of an unmarried woman staying in a bachelor's home, housekeeper or no. "You're both very kind, but I've already imposed too much." "Nonsense," Preston said firmly. "Besides, Elijah brought your trunk back yesterday. Might as well stay until you can wear your own clothes again." Clara relented, secretly relieved. The thought of facing an unknown town and an inherited business while still feeling so weak was daunting. "Very well, Mr. Sawyer. I accept your gracious hospitality for a few more days." That evening, against Mrs. Abernathy's protests, but with Preston's support, Clara joined them at the dinner table. Dressed in one of her simpler day dresses, a sage green cotton that complemented her hazel eyes, she felt almost human again, though walking from the bedroom to the dining room had left her embarrassingly winded. The Sawyer home was modest but well built, with sturdy furniture and a few unexpected touches of refinement. A piano stood in one corner of the parlor and bookshelves lined one wall. It spoke of prosperity without ostentation, and Clara found herself warming to the place. "This is a lovely home, Mr. Sawyer," she commented as she took small bites of the venison stew Mrs. Abernathy had prepared. "Thank you. My father built it 20 years ago when he claimed this land, added the second story when he married my mother." A shadow crossed Preston's face. "They've both been gone 3 years now, influenza." "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said softly. "I lost my parents as well, my mother when I was 12 and my father last year." Their eyes met across the table, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. "It's not easy being alone in the world," Preston acknowledged, "but I've been fortunate to have good people around me." He nodded toward Mrs. Abernathy, who was busy serving more stew. "Somebody's got to make sure this boy eats something besides beef jerky and coffee," the housekeeper said gruffly, but Clara noticed the affection in her eyes. "You have family elsewhere, Miss Calloway?" Preston asked. Clara hesitated. "No close family. My mother had a sister in Boston, but we've not been in contact for many years." She didn't elaborate on why she had left Philadelphia so hastily. How could she explain that she had been engaged to Edward Blackburn, son of one of the city's most prominent families, only to discover his true nature days before the wedding? His violence when drunk had shocked her, but it was his callous response when she'd broken the engagement that had destroyed her reputation. Edward had spread vicious rumors that she had been unfaithful, and Philadelphia society, always eager for scandal, had believed him without question. The letter from her uncle's lawyer had arrived at the perfect moment, offering an escape and a fresh start. No one in Truth or Consequences would know her shame or judge her for a scandal not of her making. "Miss Calloway, are you feeling unwell?" Preston's concerned voice broke into her thoughts. Clara realized she had been staring at her plate. "Forgive me, I'm a bit tired, that's all." "Perhaps you should retire early," Mrs. Abernathy suggested. "You've done well for your first day up, but you mustn't overdo it." Clara nodded, grateful for the excuse. "Yes, I think that would be wise." "Thank you for the delicious meal." Preston stood immediately. "Let me help you back to your room." Before she could protest, he was beside her chair, offering his arm. Clara accepted, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her stomach when her hand touched his forearm. She could feel the strength in him, yet he guided her with gentle care. At her door, she paused. "Thank you again, Mr. Sawyer, for everything." He studied her face for a moment, and Clara felt her cheeks grow warm under his gaze. "It's my pleasure, Miss Calloway. Sleep well." The next morning brought a clear blue sky and slightly cooler temperatures. Clara woke feeling considerably stronger and ventured to the window to look out over the Sawyer ranch for the first time. The landscape took her breath away, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, distant mesas glowing red in the morning light, and the vast blue sky that seemed to go on forever. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing, and closer to the house, several horses in a corral. A man she assumed was Elijah was leading a chestnut mare in circles. A knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, turning from the window. Mrs. Abernathy entered with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, Miss Calloway." "You're looking better today, got some color back in your cheeks that isn't sunburn," Clara smiled. "I feel much improved. I thought perhaps I might take a short walk outside this morning if that's not too ambitious." The housekeeper set the tray down. "Mr. Sawyer said you might want to get some air. He's waiting on the porch whenever you're ready. Said he'd show you around a bit if you're feeling up to it." Clara felt that strange flutter again. "That's very kind of him." After breakfast, Clara pinned her hair carefully and donned her straw bonnet to protect her still tender skin from the sun. When she stepped onto the porch, Preston was waiting, his tall form leaning against a post. He straightened immediately, and Clara couldn't help noticing how the morning light brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. "Miss Calloway," he greeted her with a slight bow, "you're looking well this morning." "Thank you, the fresh air already feels wonderful." She took a deep breath, savoring the scent of sage and sun-warmed earth. "I thought you might like to see the ranch," Preston offered, extending his arm. "Just a short tour, nothing too taxing." Clara accepted his arm, and they descended the porch steps together. He led her first to the corral, where Elijah was still working with the chestnut mare. "That's Liberty," Preston explained. "She's a bit high-spirited, but she'll make a fine mount once she's properly trained." "She's beautiful," Clara said, admiring the mare's glossy coat and intelligent eyes. "Do you ride, Miss Calloway?" Clara nodded. "I learned as a girl. My father kept horses in Philadelphia, though I imagine riding here is quite different." "Different terrain, certainly, but the principles remain the same." Preston whistled, and a bay stallion trotted over to the fence. "This is Thunder, the horse that carried us both back to the ranch. He's the best cow pony I've ever owned." Clara reached out hesitantly to stroke the horse's velvety nose. "Thank you for the ride, Thunder," she said with a small smile, "though I'm afraid I don't remember it." Preston chuckled, a warm sound that Clara found herself wanting to hear again. Probably for the best, it wasn't the most comfortable journey. They continued their tour, with Preston showing her the small vegetable garden Mrs. Abernathy maintained, the bunkhouse where Elijah and two other ranch hands lived, and the barn with its sweet smell of hay and leather. By the time they reached a small rise overlooking the ranch, Clara was tired but exhilarated. They sat on a weathered bench placed strategically to capture the view. "Your ranch is impressive, Mr. Sawyer," she said sincerely. "You've clearly worked hard to make it thrive." Preston looked out over his land with quiet pride. "My father started with nothing but a small herd and determination. I've tried to build on what he began." He glanced at her. "And what about you, Miss Calloway? What are your plans for your uncle's store?" Clara sighed, twisting her hands in her lap. I hardly know. I've never run a business before. My education prepared me to be a suitable wife for a man of means, not a shopkeeper. The mercantile is well established with a loyal clientele, Preston said, and truth or consequences is growing. With the railroad coming through next year, it could be quite profitable. Perhaps. But I know nothing about inventory or accounting, or your uncle's assistant manager, Mr. Jenkins, has been running things since Harry passed. He's honest and experienced. He could teach you if you decided to stay. Clara looked at Preston curiously. You seem to know a great deal about my uncle's business. He smiled slightly. Every rancher for miles depends on Calloway's mercantile. And truth or consequences isn't so large that everyone doesn't know everyone else's business. I see. Clara looked out across the landscape again. It's so different from Philadelphia. Everything here feels vast, untamed. Does that frighten you? Preston asked quietly. Clara considered the question seriously. It should, perhaps, but strangely it doesn't. There's something appealing about the openness of it all, the possibility of a fresh start. Their eyes met, and Clara felt a moment of connection that both thrilled and unsettled her. There was kindness in Preston Sawyer's gaze, but something else too, an intensity that made her heart beat faster. The moment was broken by Mrs. Abernathy calling from the house that lunch was ready. Preston stood and offered Clara his hand. Shall we head back? You shouldn't overdo it on your first real day up and about. Clara placed her hand in his, trying to ignore the warmth that spread up her arm at his touch. Yes, I think that would be wise. That afternoon, Clara rested as prescribed, but her thoughts kept returning to Preston Sawyer. There was something about him that intrigued her, his quiet strength, his evident care for his land and animals, the gentle way he had guided her around the ranch. It had been a long time since she had felt so comfortable in a man's presence, especially after Edward's betrayal. But Clara reminded herself sternly that she hadn't come to New Mexico to find romance. She had come to escape scandal and make a new life for herself. Besides, Preston was merely being kind to a woman he had rescued from certain death. It would be foolish to read anything more into his attention. The next day dawned with Clara feeling almost completely recovered. After breakfast, she found Preston in the barn, repairing a saddle. Mr. Sawyer, she began, steeling herself for what needed to be said. I want to thank you for your extraordinary kindness these past few days, but I really must impose on you no further. I'd like to go to truth or consequences today if you're still willing to take me. Preston looked up from his work, a flash of something disappointment, crossing his face before he nodded. Of course, Miss Calloway, if you're certain you're strong enough for the journey. I am, she affirmed, though a small part of her wished she had reason to stay longer. Very well. I'll have Elijah prepare the wagon after lunch. We can leave around 2 o'clock. That will get us to town before sunset. Clara nodded, suddenly unsure what else to say. I'll go pack my things. As she turned to leave, Preston called after her. Miss Calloway, she paused in the doorway. Yes. Truth or Consequences is a fine town, but it can be a bit overwhelming for newcomers. If you need any assistance getting settled, or anything at all, really, you can call on me. The sincerity in his voice touched her. Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. I appreciate that more than I can say. Back in her room, Clara carefully packed her trunk with Mrs. Abernathy's help. The housekeeper had washed and pressed Clara's clothes, and even mended a tear in one of her shirt-waists. Mr. Sawyer says he's taking you to town this afternoon, the older woman remarked as she folded a petticoat. Yes, it's time I stopped imposing on your hospitality and faced my new responsibilities. Mrs. Abernathy snorted. Imposing? Child, this house hasn't had a woman's touch since Mr. Sawyer's mother passed. Having you here has been good for him, whether he realizes it or not. Clara felt her cheeks warm. Mrs. Abernathy, don't you worry, I'm not playing matchmaker, the housekeeper interrupted with a knowing smile. Just making an observation. That boy's been alone too long, running this ranch and keeping to himself. Having a pretty young woman to rescue gave him something else to think about for a change. Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply continued packing. But the housekeeper's words stayed with her as she prepared to leave the Sawyer ranch. The journey to truth or consequences took just over 3 hours in Preston's wagon. They traveled mostly in comfortable silence, with Preston occasionally pointing out landmarks or telling Clara about the area. As they neared the town, the landscape became slightly less arid, with cottonwood trees marking the path of a river. The Rio Grande, Preston explained as they crossed a sturdy wooden bridge. Lifeblood of the territory. Without it, none of us would be here. Clara watched the muddy water flowing beneath them. It's not what I imagined. In Philadelphia, we have the Delaware River, which is much wider. The Rio Grande may not look impressive here, but it's vital to everything in the valley. You'll come to appreciate it, especially in summer. The road widened as they approached truth or consequences, and Clara saw more signs of habitation, a small farm, than another, and finally the outskirts of the town itself. Compared to Philadelphia, it was minuscule, but to Clara's surprise, it was larger and more developed than she had expected. A main street lined with wooden buildings stretched before them, with cross streets creating a rough grid pattern. There were several saloons, a hotel, a church, various shops, and what appeared to be a courthouse or municipal building. People moved along the boardwalks, and horses and wagons traversed the dusty street. "Where's my uncle's store?" Clara asked, trying to take everything in at once. "Calloway's Mercantile is the largest building on the left," Preston said, pointing ahead. "See the two-story structure with the green awning?" Clara spotted it, an imposing wooden building with large display windows and a sign that proclaimed Calloway's Mercantile. Everything from needles to plows. It was indeed the largest commercial establishment on the street, and Clara felt a surge of pride mixed with trepidation. This was her inheritance, her future. Preston guided the wagon to a stop in front of the store. "Here we are, Miss Calloway, your new home." As he helped her down from the wagon, Clara was acutely aware that their time together was coming to an end. "Mr. Sawyer, I can never thank you enough for everything you've done," he smiled down at her, still holding her hand. "It was my pleasure, truly." He seemed about to say more when the store's door opened, and an older man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard stepped out. "Mr. Sawyer," he greeted, then turned curious eyes to Clara. "And this must be Miss Calloway. We've been expecting you for several days." "I'm Henry Jenkins, your uncle's assistant manager." "Mr. Jenkins," Clara acknowledged with a nod. "I apologize for the delay. I had an accident on the journey. Mr. Sawyer kindly took me in until I recovered." Jenkins raised his eyebrows but didn't comment on this explanation. "Well, you're here now. We have rooms prepared for you above the store, your uncle's living quarters. Would you like to see them?" "Yes, thank you," Clara said, then turned back to Preston, who was unloading her trunk. "Mr. Sawyer, would you care to come in?" "I'm sure Mr. Jenkins could offer refreshments after your long drive." Preston hesitated, glancing at Jenkins. "I should probably get back to the ranch before dark, but perhaps another time." Clara tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, thank you again for everything." He tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Calloway, Mr. Jenkins." As Preston drove away, Clara felt a curious sense of loss. She shook it off and followed Jenkins into her new life. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind as Clara familiarized herself with her inheritance. The Mercantile was indeed a thriving business, offering everything from foodstuffs to farm equipment, fabric to firearms. The living quarters above were surprisingly spacious and well-appointed, with a parlor, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small study that had been her uncle's office. Henry Jenkins proved to be invaluable, patiently explaining the operation of the store, introducing her to regular customers, and teaching her the basics of the accounting system. There was also a young clerk named Thomas who helped with the heavier items and deliveries, and a local woman, Mrs. Wilkins, who came in 3 times a week to clean. Clara gradually met other residents of truth or consequences, including the banker Mr. Peterson, Sheriff Miles, and Reverend Thompson and his wife, who invited her to Sunday services. The townspeople were generally welcoming, though Clara sensed their curiosity about the Eastern lady who had suddenly appeared to claim Old Harry's business. Despite her busy days, Clara found herself thinking often of Preston Sawyer. She had half expected, half hoped that he might come to town on business and stop by the store, but there had been no sign of him. She told herself it was natural to think of the man who had saved her life, nothing more. Then, nearly 3 weeks after her arrival in Truth or Consequences, the bell above the store door jingled late one afternoon. Clara looked up from the inventory ledger she was reviewing to see Preston standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice as she stood. "What a lovely surprise." He smiled, and Clara's heart did that strange flutter again. "Miss Calloway, you're looking well. Town life seems to agree with you." "I'm settling in, yes." "Mr. Jenkins has been a wonderful teacher." Preston nodded, looking around the store. "Place looks good, not that I'd expect anything less from Calloway's." An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Preston cleared his throat. "Actually, Miss Calloway, I came to town on business, but I also wanted to extend an invitation. Truth or Consequences is having its Founders' Day celebration this Saturday. There's a picnic in the afternoon and a dance in the evening. I thought you might like to attend. With me." Clara felt her cheeks grow warm. "A dance? Yes, madam. Nothing fancy like you might be used to in Philadelphia, just a community gathering at the town hall, but it's a good way to meet people and—" He hesitated. "I'd be honored to escort you if you're agreeable." Clara found herself smiling. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Sawyer." The relief on his face was evident. "Excellent. I'll call for you at 4 on Saturday then." After he left, Clara couldn't stop smiling despite Henry Jenkins' knowing looks. Saturday dawned clear and pleasant. Clara spent more time than she would admit selecting her outfit, finally deciding on a blue cotton dress with white trim that was fancy enough for a dance, but not so formal as to seem out of place in a frontier town. At precisely 4 o'clock, Preston arrived in his wagon, freshly shaven and wearing a clean white shirt with his best vest. His eyes widened appreciatively when Clara descended the stairs. "Miss Calloway, you look beautiful," he said, his admiration evident. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer. You're looking quite handsome yourself." The picnic was held in a grassy area near the river, with tables set up under cottonwood trees. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the occasion. Clara met more people than she could possibly remember, but everyone was friendly and welcoming. "Your uncle was well respected here," Preston explained as they filled their plates with fried chicken, cornbread, and various salads contributed by the town's women. "People are curious about you but predisposed to like Harry Calloway's niece." They found a spot somewhat apart from the main crowd and sat on a blanket Preston had brought. As they ate, Clara found herself relaxing in his company. "Tell me about your life before Truth or Consequences," Preston said. "What was Philadelphia like?" Clara chose her words carefully. "Very different from here, more confined in many ways. There are expectations for how a lady should behave, who she should associate with, even what opinions she should hold." "And you didn't fit those expectations?" Preston asked perceptively. Clara sighed. "I tried to. For many years I did exactly what was expected of me, but eventually—" She paused, debating how much to reveal. "Eventually you wanted something more," Preston finished for her. She looked at him gratefully. "Yes, or something different at least, and that's what brought you here." "The desire for something different," Clara nodded, relieved not to have to explain about Edward and the scandal. "That, and having nowhere else to go after my father died. The inheritance was unexpected but welcomed." Preston seemed to understand she didn't want to elaborate further. He changed the subject, telling her about the history of Truth or Consequences and pointing out various townspeople, sharing amusing anecdotes about them. As the sun began to set, people started packing up and heading toward the town hall for the dance. Preston offered Clara his arm, and they joined the procession. The town hall had been transformed with paper lanterns and bunting. A small band consisting of a fiddle, guitar, banjo, and piano was setting up on a raised platform at one end of the room. "It's charming," Clara said, taking in the festive atmosphere. "Wait until the dancing starts," Preston replied with a smile. "Some of these old-timers can still cut quite a figure, despite their age and ailments." He was right. Once the music began, the floor quickly filled with couples of all ages. Clara watched with delight as dignified shopkeepers and their wives transformed into energetic dancers. "May I have this dance, Miss Calloway?" Preston asked, extending his hand. Clara placed her hand in his. "I should warn you, I only know Eastern dances. Your Western reels might be beyond me." "I'll teach you," he promised, leading her onto the floor. The dance was a lively affair, with Preston patiently guiding Clara through the unfamiliar steps. She stumbled occasionally, but his strong arms kept her from falling, and soon she was laughing and moving with more confidence. During a break in the dancing, Preston brought her a cup of punch. "You're a quick learner," he complimented. "Most city folk take much longer to catch on." "I had an excellent teacher," she replied, smiling up at him. As the evening progressed, the band played a waltz and Preston drew Clara closer. The feeling of his hand on her waist, the nearness of him as they moved together across the floor, sent her heart racing. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on them, but for once she didn't mind being the subject of speculation. "You dance beautifully, Mr. Sawyer," she said, surprised at his grace given his size and usual occupation. "My mother insisted I learn," he replied with a slight smile. Said no son of hers was going to stomp around a dance floor like a bull in a china shop. Clara laughed. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. His eyes grew distant for a moment before returning to hers. "She would have liked you, I think." The simple statement touched Clara deeply. "I would have liked to meet her." As the waltz ended, they remained standing close together, reluctant to part. The moment was broken by Sheriff Miles approaching with his wife. "Sawyer, Miss Calloway," the sheriff greeted them with a nod. "Fine evening, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Sheriff," Preston agreed, stepping back from Clara but staying close to her side. "We're pleased you could join our celebration, Miss Calloway," Mrs. Miles said warmly. "How are you finding Truth or Consequences? It's a lovely community," Clara replied sincerely. "Everyone has been very welcoming. Good to hear. Your uncle was an important part of this town, big shoes to fill, but folks are saying you're doing just fine at the Mercantile." The conversation continued pleasantly, but Clara noticed several meaningful glances passing between the sheriff and his wife as they observed her standing close to Preston. News of their attendance at the dance together would certainly make the rounds of town gossip. When the evening finally came to an end, Preston drove Clara back to the Mercantile. The night was clear, with countless stars overhead and a nearly full moon illuminating the road. "I had a wonderful time," Clara said as they approached the town. "Thank you for inviting me." "It was my pleasure," Preston replied, his voice warm in the darkness. "I've enjoyed your company, Miss Calloway." When they reached the Mercantile, Preston helped her down from the wagon. They stood facing each other in the moonlight, both reluctant for the evening to end. Would you like to come in for some coffee?" Clara asked impulsively, then immediately wondered if she had been too forward. Preston hesitated. "I should probably get back to the ranch. It's late." "Of course," Clara said quickly, hiding her disappointment. But he continued, taking her hand gently in his. "I was wondering if I might call on you again." "Perhaps next Sunday after church," Clara's heart lifted. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Sawyer." "Preston," he said softly. "I'd like it if you called me Preston." "Preston," she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. "And you must call me Clara," he smiled, still holding her hand. Clara. For a moment she thought he might kiss her and found herself hoping he would. But he merely raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Clara. I'll see you Sunday." "Good night, Preston, and thank you again for a lovely evening." As Clara prepared for bed that night, her mind was filled with thoughts of Preston Sawyer, his smile, his gentle strength, the way he had guided her through the dances. For the first time since arriving in Truth or Consequences, she felt truly hopeful about her new life. Over the next few weeks, Preston became a regular visitor to the Mercantile. Sometimes he came on legitimate business, ordering supplies for the ranch or picking up special orders, but increasingly, his visits had no purpose beyond seeing Clara. They established a routine of Sunday afternoons together after church services. Sometimes they would have dinner at the hotel restaurant, Other times, Clara would prepare a meal in her quarters above the store. Preston introduced her to his favorite spots around Truth, or Consequences, a particular bend in the river where cottonwood trees provided shade for picnics. A hill overlooking the town that offered spectacular sunset views, a hidden spring where wildflowers bloomed even in the heat of summer. Clara flourished under his attention and the growing independence of running her uncle's business. Henry Jenkins continued to teach her the mercantile trade, and she began to make small changes to the store, adding more fabrics and notions that might appeal to the town's women, reorganizing displays to better showcase certain products, and introducing a lending library of sorts with a small collection of books that customers could borrow for a nominal fee. The people of Truth or Consequences gradually accepted her as one of their own. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society that met weekly to sew quilts for the needy and organized charitable events. She attended town meetings and offered the mercantile as a gathering place for community discussions. And through it all, her feelings for Preston deepened. She found herself watching the door whenever the bell jingled, hoping it would be him. She treasured their conversations, his quiet humor, the way he listened attentively when she spoke. When their hands accidentally touched across the counter, or while walking side by side, a thrill ran through her that was both frightening and exhilarating. Summer was drawing to a close when Preston invited her to dinner at the hotel one Sunday evening. He seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and starting several conversations only to let them trail off unfinished. "Preston, is everything all right?" Clara finally asked. "You seem distracted this evening." He looked at her, a mix of emotions crossing his face. "I'm sorry, Clara. I've been wanting to ask you something, and I can't seem to find the right words." Clara's heart began to race. "You can ask me anything," she said softly. Preston took a deep breath. "I know you haven't been here long, and you're still settling into your new life, and I don't want to presume." He paused, then reached across the table to take her hand. "Clara, these past months have been the happiest I can remember in a very long time. You've brought something to my life that I didn't even know was missing." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "You've done the same for me, Preston." "I can't imagine my life without you in it now," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "What I'm trying to say, Clara Calloway, is that I've fallen in love with you, deeply, completely in love, and if you could find it in your heart to consider me, I would be honored if you would become my wife." Though she had begun to hope for such a proposal, the reality of it momentarily robbed Clara of speech. She stared at Preston, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that he had spoken too soon. "Oh, Preston," she finally managed, squeezing his hand. Yes, I would be honored to be your wife." Relief and joy transformed his face. "Truly," Clara nodded, tears now flowing freely. "I love you too. I think I've been falling in love with you since you found me in the desert." Preston stood and came around the table, pulling Clara to her feet and into his arms, heedless of the other diners watching with undisguised interest. "You've made me the happiest man in New Mexico territory," he murmured before lowering his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Clara responded with all the love in her heart, her arms sliding around his neck as the kiss deepened. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. "Well," Preston said with a chuckle, "I believe we've just announced our engagement to the entire town." Clara glanced around at the smiling faces of the other patrons and couldn't bring herself to care about propriety. "Good. Saves us the trouble of telling everyone individually." The news of their engagement spread through Truth or Consequences like wildfire. By the following morning, it seemed everyone knew and had an opinion to share, fortunately, most of them positive. Mrs. Abernathy arrived at the mercantile before noon, ostensibly to purchase supplies but really to embrace Clara and tell her how pleased she was. "I knew from the moment he brought you to the ranch that you were special," the housekeeper declared. "Never seen that boy look at anyone the way he looks at you." Henry Jenkins offered his congratulations as well, though he seemed concerned about what would happen to the mercantile after Clara married. "Will you be selling the store, Miss Calloway?" he asked anxiously. "No, Mr. Jenkins," Clara assured him. "Preston and I have discussed it." I'll continue to run the mercantile, with your invaluable assistance, of course. We'll divide our time between the ranch and the rooms above the store, depending on the season and the needs of both businesses. This solution satisfied Jenkins, who had feared losing his position if a new owner took over. Reverend Thompson called on them that afternoon to discuss wedding plans. The church is at your disposal, of course, he told them. Have you considered a date? Preston looked at Clara. We were thinking perhaps mid-October, if that's not too soon. The autumn cattle drive will be finished by then, and the weather should still be pleasant. October would be lovely, Clara agreed. It gives us just enough time to prepare without an unnecessarily long engagement. The Reverend nodded approvingly. A sensible decision. I'll pencil you in for October 15th if that suits. With the date set, Clara found herself swept up in wedding preparations. Though she had no family to help, the women of truth or consequences stepped in enthusiastically. Mrs. Miles offered her daughter's wedding dress, which could be altered to fit Clara. Mrs. Thompson organized the church decorations, and Mrs. Wilkins promised to bake the wedding cake. Clara wrote to her aunt in Boston, not really expecting a response but feeling obligated to inform her remaining family of her marriage. To her surprise, a reply came 2 weeks later, congratulating her and enclosing a small lace handkerchief that had belonged to Clara's mother. Something old, Preston said when Clara showed him the handkerchief with tears in her eyes. Yes, she agreed. Now I just need something new, something borrowed, and something blue. I might be able to help with one of those, Preston said mysteriously. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Preston visited as often as ranch duties allowed, sometimes staying in town for a day or two. They planned their future together, how they would balance the ranch and the mercantile, where they would live, even tentative discussions about children. I always wanted a large family, Preston admitted as they sat on the porch behind the mercantile one evening, watching the stars come out. My parents only had me, and it was lonely at times. Clara leaned against his shoulder. I'd like that too. I was an only child as well. He put his arm around her. How many children would you like? 2 at least, she said after a moment's thought. Perhaps 3 or 4 if we're blessed. Preston kissed the top of her head. I can already picture them, little girls with your hazel eyes and chestnut hair. And strong boys with their father's kind heart and steady hands, Clara added, turning her face up for a proper kiss. Their wedding day dawned clear and cool, with just a hint of autumn in the air. Clara woke early, too excited to sleep. Mrs. Wilkins arrived to help her dress and style her hair, bringing with her a bouquet of late wildflowers mixed with greenery. Something borrowed, the older woman said, pinning a small cameo to Clara's dress. It was my mother's. I wore it at my wedding and my daughter at hers. It's beautiful, Clara said, touching the delicate carving. Thank you. The altered wedding dress fit perfectly, its simple lines and modest train suitable for a frontier wedding. With her mother's handkerchief tucked into her sleeve and Mrs. Wilkins' cameo at her throat, Clara felt almost ready. A knock at the door revealed Henry Jenkins, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday suit. Miss Calloway, that is, the staff at the mercantile, we wanted to give you this. He held out a small package. Inside was a pair of delicate blue satin slippers. Something blue, Jenkins said with a rare smile, and new. Tears threatened to spill over. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, they're perfect. With no father to give her away, Clara had asked Henry to escort her down the aisle. He had accepted with surprised pleasure and now offered her his arm. Shall we, Miss Calloway? Your groom is waiting. The church was filled to capacity with what seemed like every resident of truth or consequences. As Clara walked down the aisle on Henry's arm, she had eyes only for Preston, standing tall and handsome beside Reverend Thompson at the altar. His face lit up when he saw her, and in that moment, all Clara's doubts and fears about her new life vanished. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. When Preston slipped a gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, he whispered Clara felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Thompson declared. "Mr. Sawyer, you may kiss your bride." Preston needed no further invitation. He gathered Clara into his arms and kissed her with a passion that drew cheers and a few good-natured whistles from the congregation. The celebration afterward was held in the town hall, just as the Founders' Day dance had been. There was food and music, and dancing long into the night. Clara danced with her new husband, with Henry Jenkins, with Sheriff Miles and numerous other well-wishers, but her favorite moments were when Preston would claim her for another turn around the floor, holding her close as if he couldn't bear to let her go. As the evening wore on, Preston whispered in her ear, "Ready to leave, Mrs. Sawyer?" The new name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered back, "take me home." They slipped away amid cheers and thrown rice, climbing into Preston's wagon, which had been decorated with ribbons and a "just married" sign by the ranch hands. Instead of heading toward the mercantile, Preston turned the horses toward the ranch. "I thought we might spend our wedding night at the ranch," he explained. "More privacy?" Clara blushed but nodded, suddenly shy now that they were alone and the reality of being husband and wife was upon them. Preston seemed to sense her nervousness and kept the conversation light during the journey, telling her about the improvements he had made to the house in preparation for her arrival. "Mrs. Abernathy has been cleaning for days," he said with a chuckle. "She said the house needed a woman's touch before you could properly call it home." When they arrived at the ranch, Preston surprised Clara by lifting her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sawyer," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the parlor. Clara looked around the familiar room, seeing it with new eyes. "It's strange I was only here for a few days when you rescued me, but it already feels like home in a way Philadelphia never did." Preston took her hands in his. "That's because you belong here with me." Their first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate as they discovered each other in new ways. Clara, who had feared this aspect of marriage after hearing whispered horror stories from newlywed acquaintances in Philadelphia, found instead a deep connection that brought them even closer. In the quiet aftermath, lying in Preston's arms with her head on his chest, Clara marveled at how her life had changed in just a few short months. From the desperate woman collapsing in the desert to store proprietor to beloved wife, it seemed like a dream. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, stroking her hair. "That I'm incredibly lucky," she replied honestly. "If that stagecoach hadn't broken down, if you hadn't found me when you did." "I would have found you eventually," Preston said with certainty. "Maybe not in the desert, but somehow, someway we would have met." "I believe that with all my heart." Clara rose on one elbow to look at her husband's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," he said, pulling her down for a kiss. "Some things are just meant to be, Clara Sawyer, life as Mrs. Preston Sawyer required adjustments, but brought more joy than Clara had ever imagined possible. As planned, they divided their time between the ranch and the rooms above the mercantile, establishing a rhythm that allowed them to manage both businesses effectively. Henry Jenkins continued as assistant manager, allowing Clara to spend more time at the ranch during busy seasons like calving and the cattle drive. Similarly, during the quieter winter months at the ranch, Preston would stay in town more, helping Clara with inventory and the increased business that the approaching railroad brought to Truth or Consequences. Their first Christmas as a married couple was celebrated at the ranch, with Mrs. Abernathy outdoing herself with a feast that included a roast turkey, 3 types of pie, and all the trimmings. They invited the ranch hands, Henry Jenkins, and a few close friends from town, filling the house with laughter and warmth. Preston's gift to Clara was a beautiful painting of the ranch house at sunset, commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through Truth or Consequences in the fall. Clara's gift to him was more personal. She placed a small wrapped package in his hands after everyone had left, and they sat alone by the fire. "What's this?" he asked, turning the box curiously. "Open it and see," Clara replied, watching his face anxiously. Inside was a tiny pair of hand-knitted booties. Preston stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment, then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Clara, are you?" She nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. The doctor confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby in early summer. Preston whooped with joy, lifting Clara from her chair and spinning her around before setting her down gently, suddenly concerned. Should I be doing that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby. Clara laughed, cupping his face in her hands. I'm pregnant, not made of glass, but I appreciate your concern. He knelt before her, placing his hands reverently on her still flat stomach. Hello in there, little one. I'm your pa, and I can't wait to meet you. The simple gesture brought fresh tears to Clara's eyes. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. The months of Clara's pregnancy passed with Preston hovering protectively, much to her amused exasperation. He insisted she rest more, hired additional help at the mercantile, and even brought a doctor all the way from Santa Fe to check on her when she experienced some discomfort in her 5th month. Preston, women have been having babies since the beginning of time, she reminded him after he insisted on carrying her up the stairs to their bedroom above the mercantile. And most of them without nearly so much fussing. None of them were carrying my child, he replied stubbornly. And none of them were you. Their son, William Harold Sawyer, was born on a warm June evening in 1879 after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. He had Preston's dark hair, and when he finally opened his eyes, Clara's hazel coloring. He's perfect, Preston whispered, cradling his newborn son with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Absolutely perfect. Clara watched her husband and son together, her heart so full of love it seemed impossible to contain. I never knew I could be this happy, she admitted. Preston carefully placed the baby in her arms and sat beside her on the bed, one arm around her shoulders. This is just the beginning, my love, just the beginning. Life with a new baby brought challenges, especially as they continued to balance the ranch and the mercantile. But they adapted, with Mrs. Abernathy proving to be an enthusiastic grandmother figure to little William, and Henry Jenkins surprising everyone with his gentle way with the baby when Clara brought him to the store. The railroad arrived in Truth or Consequences in the fall of 1879, bringing increased business to the mercantile and making it easier for the Sawyers to ship cattle to eastern markets. The town grew rapidly, with new businesses opening and more settlers arriving monthly. William thrived, growing from a colicky infant to a sturdy toddler who loved nothing more than to ride in front of his father on Thunder, squealing with delight as the gentle horse carried them around the ranch. On their 2nd wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Clara with a trip to Santa Fe, their first real holiday since their marriage. Mrs. Abernathy insisted she could manage William for a few days, practically shooing them out the door. You two need some time alone, she declared. That child has been the center of your world since he arrived, and rightly so. But husbands and wives need to remember they're more than just ma and pa sometimes. The trip was a revelation, 3 days of uninterrupted time together, exploring the territorial capital, enjoying meals without having to tend to a toddler, and rediscovering the passion that had sometimes been neglected in the exhaustion of new parenthood. We should do this once a year, Preston suggested as they lay in bed on their final morning, reluctant to begin the journey home despite missing their son. Make it a tradition. Clara agreed, though she added with a smile, next year we might have 2 children to leave with Mrs. Abernathy. Preston's eyes widened. Are you saying? She nodded, laughing at his expression. I'm not absolutely certain yet, but I suspect we'll be welcoming another little Sawyer around April. He gathered her close, his joy evident in every line of his body. I love you, Clara Sawyer. More every day, if that's possible. And I love you, Preston, more than I ever thought possible. Their 2nd child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose, was born in April 1881 with her mother's chestnut hair and her father's deep brown eyes. William, now nearly 2, regarded his new sister with a mixture of curiosity and concern, patting her head gently when encouraged and bringing his favorite toys to share with her, though she was far too young to appreciate the gesture. The years passed in a blur of happy moments and inevitable challenges. The ranch prospered under Preston's management, expanding to include more land and a larger herd. The mercantile thrived as well, with Clara introducing innovations like a mail order catalog for remote customers and a delivery service for the town's residents. 2 more children joined the Sawyer family, another son, James, in 1883, and a second daughter, Margaret, in 1886. Their home was filled with laughter, occasional tears, and the constant activity that 4 children inevitably created. Through it all, Preston and Clara's love for each other deepened and matured. The passionate attraction that had drawn them together in the beginning evolved into a partnership of equals, a friendship as well as a romance, a shared life built on mutual respect and unwavering support. On the 10th anniversary of the day Preston had found Clara collapsed in the desert, they returned to the spot, or as near as they could determine, with a picnic lunch and their 4 children. "This is where Pa rescued Ma," Preston told the children as they spread blankets in the shade of a lone mesquite tree. "She was all alone and very sick from the heat." "Were you scared, Ma?" 8-year-old William asked, his hazel eyes serious. Clara smiled, remembering, "I was at first. But then your father found me, and I knew somehow that everything would be all right." "Did you fall in love right away?" Elizabeth wanted to know. Ever the romantic at 7 years old, Preston laughed, reaching for Clara's hand. "I thought your mother was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, even though she was half dead from the heat. But love came a little later." "When did you know you loved Papa?" 5-year-old James asked Clara, snuggling against her side. Clara exchanged a warm glance with her husband. "I think I started falling in love with him when he taught me to dance at the Founders' Day celebration, but I knew for certain when he asked me to marry him. And I knew I loved your mother when I realized I couldn't imagine my life without her in it," Preston added. 3-year-old Margaret, not interested in romantic tales, had wandered a few feet away to investigate a lizard sunning itself on a rock. "Lizard," she announced proudly, pointing. The moment broken, they all laughed and turned their attention to the picnic Mrs. Abernathy had packed. But later, as they drove home with tired children dozing in the back of the wagon, Clara leaned against Preston's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the road but squeezing her hand. "For finding me that day, for saving my life in more ways than one." Preston turned to look at her, his eyes filled with the same love she had seen in them for 10 years. "Thank you for making my life complete, Clara Sawyer. I can't imagine a day without you." As they approached the ranch house, silhouetted against the setting sun, Clara felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate escape from Philadelphia to the near-death experience in the desert, to the beautiful life she now shared with Preston and their children, every step, even the painful ones, had led her home. And home, she had learned, wasn't a place at all. It was the people you loved and who loved you in return. It was the life you built together, the memories you created, the future you planned side by side. As Preston helped her down from the wagon, their sleeping youngest daughter in his arms, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home the moment Preston Sawyer had found her in the desert and brought her back to life, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. "I love you," she whispered as they carried their children inside. "And I love you," he replied, his voice holding the same promise it had on their wedding day. "Always and forever." The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, a fitting backdrop to the life they had created together, a life that had begun with a desperate journey, a chance encounter, and a love that had saved them both.